Thank you so much, Carol. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And first off, I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, taking time out of your very busy schedules. I am personally very excited about this topic, and so pleased to be joined by just two outstanding security professionals that have brought so much value to the security community, industrial control systems over so many years. You're going to feel that as soon as they get into today's material. So certainly welcome to both John and Paul, and thank you for joining. This particular topic around a new hosted course that SANS, working in collaboration with AE Solutions, is bringing forward is one that we're very pleased about, because for those of you that have looked at other courses that SANS offers, they are oriented towards a variety of different roles, operators, controls engineers, those that are in hybrid roles that are bridging information technology, operational technology. We're so pleased to be bringing this topic in that really is focusing on the managers and the challenges that managers face at building teams, at garnering budgets, and just working through some of the more unique challenges that they face. So I'm going to front end this just a little bit, and then very quickly here turn it over to both John and Paul so they can get into the meat of today's conversation. So for so many of you, whether you're relatively new to industry or if you have many years of experience, regardless, you've already seen the type of revolution that has led to substantial change across industry, and industrial control systems are not immune to this. We know that everything is connected and only becoming more and more connected. We continue to see a variety of new devices that are giving us visibility that we hadn't had in the past. And through that visibility, new capabilities for us to increase our efficiency, our productivity, ultimately our profitability. Tremendous revolution here, many positives, but of course there's also increased risks that come into play. This is part of the manager's challenge. This is part of everybody's challenge. And for those that are trying to establish workable security frameworks and programs and policies and practices, this is something that is only going to continue, obviously. To our operations, we focus on industrial control systems and the automation because of the value that they bring. There are many different roles that are interacting with these systems, from an operator, a maintainer of these systems. The plant management view is really often a very comprehensive view, looking at how operations is running. Again, getting back to productivity and efficiency, but there's that added responsibility of not only managing those operations, but also interacting with the rest of the organization to provide direct feedback about how things are running. And if there are troubles, what are the actions that are being taken to proactively address those types of issues? The company managers today that are running these programs that are focused on reliable, safe operations, these are challenges that don't just live for today. The systems that are being installed in 2019 are still going to be running in 2029, 2039, and the world will continue to change. And we know that it's a rare occasion we have an opportunity with a clean slate to engineer the perfect system that we're going to turnkey on day one. Many systems are systems that are constantly evolving and have to be modified. So a manager's challenge is also to keep this in mind. And that balance between people, process, and technology is one that a manager also has to be continually thinking about. The budgets that we have can't just be directed towards technology. They have to be directed towards the humans that need to make decisions about the technologies to be applied, and then the processes that are followed. Again, all to make sure that through the life cycle of the control systems and the expectations of the organization throughout this life are continually met. So risk and threats are going to continually increase. We know that. And this is the importance of building a program and having oversight and management and agility with that program as it evolves. So as we look to the future, as we think about what happens when we each have our own events that is going to affect our organization, those that are working with these systems, the larger community, when we hit that now what moment, how can we make sure that we are prepared to take appropriate action? here again, management's role is a very important one. So I like this sentence because it really hits at the core of what a manager needs to be thinking about in everything they're doing. It's not just about defining a strategy. It's making sure that there is a tactical ability to execute upon that strategy. And that is an important point. And that's precisely why at this point, I'm going to turn it over to both John and Paul, because they're going to talk about the managers and this new course and how it's going to help attack some of those challenges. So with that, John and Paul, the floor is yours.
Yeah, do you want to advance to the next slide, Doug? There you go.
Thing.
Well, yeah, thank you, Doug. This is John Cusimano, and yeah, thank you for hosting this and for organizing this. My background, it says on the slide 25 years. That's actually more like 30 years. But I'm the vice president of the Industrial Cybersecurity Division for AE Solutions. My background has been, I would say my entire career has been in and around industrial automation in one way or another. First 20 or so years of my career was working for an asset owner and some vendors as a process automation DCS SIS specialist. And then about 10 years ago, 2009, I refocused my career specifically around industrial cybersecurity. I would say in the BS era, BS meaning before Stuxnet. Is when I first got involved in industrial cybersecurity. Kind of took a chance that it was as I thought was going to be a growing field with a strong need for experts in a variety of skill sets, including industrial automation, industrial networking, cybersecurity, and so on. So I've been in this space dedicated for the last 10 years, and have had the pleasure of working with literally hundreds of people in various roles for different asset owners. I've visited, I'm sure, well over 100 different facilities in that 10-year time period, and worked with people in IT roles and OT roles and process automation roles, in operations roles, environmental health and safety, and so on. I've had the pleasure in a lot of different industries as well. So I've had the pleasure of meeting and working with individuals that have at least some responsibility, if not a lot of responsibility, or at least a portion of their responsibility is around ensuring ICS cybersecurity and helping their companies stand up and manage programs. Some of our engagements are for weeks at a time, some are for months at a time, and some people I have worked with and continue to work with for years. So it's been very enjoyable, and hope what that brings to the table here is the breadth of different companies and personalities that I've worked with has given me a really a unique sense of kind of a cutting across a lot of, as I said, different industries and clients to understand their challenges and see how they've overcome them, and some of the pitfalls too as well. So I hope to share that in the class.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Paul Rostick, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer and an Industrial Cybersecurity Advisor with AE Solutions. So my background is about 25 plus years in the oil and gas industry. I really come at this more from the owner-operator side. About 2012, my boss tapped me and said, what are we going to do about cyber risk? We really didn't have much in the way of a program or a plan to deal with and respond to this increasing level of cyber risk that we were reading about in the newspapers. So at that time, I knew that I wanted the program to be risk-based. I felt very strongly that as a commodity company in the oil and gas business, that I wasn't really concerned about somebody stealing credit cards from our company. I knew that the real risk to the operation, the real risk was in the operations primarily. So I looked around for a partner and I found John Cusimano and AE Solutions. So at that time, I was working as the security leader for Sunoco Logistics, and I worked with John and his team to help build the foundation around a risk-based cybersecurity program. And then I was at that for about 5 years. And then after that, I decided to actually join AE Solutions. And since that time, I've been working with John and with a number of our clients. I tend to work with the security managers and security leaders, the people who are actually trying to build out their programs. Oftentimes, they're facing challenges, trying to get executives aligned around funding for cybersecurity, and then working with people across the organization to try to build awareness and relationships and things like that. So I think I would like to, during the class, I want to talk about my experiences. I think the value that I could bring to the other students is that I have the scars because I actually had to build a program from scratch. So I think I have a lot of lessons learned, and I might be able to save you some time and energy and save you from maybe some dead ends.
That's perfect. Paul, John, thanks so much for the introduction. See, I told everybody on the call the pedigree that you guys have and all that experience, and clearly it's all there. So let's get into this. You can see the question on the screen here. So can you talk to us about why did you develop this course?
Sure. Can you just jump to that next slide? There you go. So what we found is that most of the courses that you can attend for ICS Cybersecurity tend to be oriented more towards the technical staff and technical skills and technical requirements. And that's good. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. SANS has a number of in-house courses, and they also have a number of hosted courses that go into great detail for operators and engineers and IT folks who are trying to focus on the technical and control aspects of their programs. But we found, and I have found in my own experience, that when I was trying to build my program, most of the challenges that I would run into were really more around the culture of the company and the commitments from the executives all the way down to the technical folks. I found, for example, that it wasn't always that challenging to implement a new technology or to write a policy or procedure. Generally, any group of competent people can do that, and there are lots of competent people. But that doesn't mean that these practices would necessarily take hold in the organization. So one of the things that we really wanted to focus on in this class was to talk about the other side of building programs, the side that has to do with understanding what's going on in the industry, how to communicate that to your executives, how to communicate the true nature of the risk to your executives, how to work across the organization, across the different silos. We just have a lot of things that we can talk about in that area. So that's really what the course is focusing on. The other thing we wanted to do with the course was we recognized that not everyone really has the bandwidth to attend a week-long class. So we've created a very, very highly concentrated, information-packed class that you can take. It only takes one day. There will be a ton of information in that one day, but we think that's a good idea for managers. And again, I just think we have a lot of on-the-ground experience that we can talk through. But John, I think, did you want to add anything else to that picture of the course?
Yeah, I think as Paul said, we wanted to provide this course for managers that are managing staff, and therefore they need to have a good broad understanding of the topic so that they can direct their staff to go take the appropriate in-depth courses and focus their efforts. But in order for a manager to be able to really direct their staff, they need to have a good high-level understanding of the topic, of the challenges, and also be able to communicate that both up and down in the organization. And so that's really our focus here, is to really help, I guess you could say, middle managers, whether that might be a plant manager or an operations supervisor or process automation control lead at the plant or at the corporate level, IT, OT professionals to help them have a good grasp of the topics, the lingo, the standards, and so on, and to be able to better direct their staff and better communicate upwards in the organization.
Yeah, John, that's so important, isn't it? Is that ability to communicate in an organization? Because here we have industrial control systems built on the foundation of digital communications, yet that human element of being able to convey where we are today, what our needs are, what a situation is. We have to adapt our language based on who we're communicating to within an organization, right?
Yeah, quite different talking to an IT professional and talking to an automation professional. But in this field, you need to do both, and you need to be able to communicate to both in a manner that makes sense to them.
Yeah, I think that plays right into your slide here.
Right. So one of the things that we want to get into in depth in the class is the emergence of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We're seeing more and more companies adopt this particular framework. Now, it's a great framework, but it's important to understand, practically what the framework is. Basically, the framework is a rationalization across many different standards. So there's a whole bunch of standards out there: NIST 853, NIST 882, ISA 62443, just to name a couple. And there are hundreds and hundreds of controls embedded in these various programs. They all kind of take slightly different approaches, maybe slightly different terminology. So the NIST framework is an umbrella framework that kind of sits on top of all of those standards, and it presents a very good starting point. But having worked with the NIST framework in my program, and also with a number of clients, including clients that we're working with right now, one of the struggles with the framework is that it's pretty big. I mean, there's over 108 subcategories, and each of the subcategories, of course, refers out to dozens of standards and controls. So one of the things we want to do in the class is to help folks wade their way through the NIST CSF and add some implementation practical guidance on how you can look at the framework, make sense of it, prioritize the parts of the framework that you want to focus on. What does it mean to create a target profile versus a current profile, and how useful are those things? So that's a very important part of the program. Is we'll go into this in depth. We have a particular approach that we have in dealing with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, if you're going to use it as the foundation, and we do recommend that people use it as a foundation for building their programs. Can we jump to the next slide, please? So the other thing that we want to talk a lot about in the class, and we talked about this a little bit before, is that one of the ultimate goals of a cybersecurity program, first of all, you do want to have a program. You don't want to just have policies and procedures and some technology. Policies and procedures and some technology do not automatically, as you can imagine, equate into a program. And of course, the purpose of a program is to sustain an outcome, right? If you have a safety program, what do you want? Well, you don't want anybody to get hurt. So the purpose of the safety program is to maintain safe operations. Quality is the same. Environmental program. So we want to get into the mindset with our executives that what we're trying to do really is build a cybersecurity program. And in order to do that, we have to figure out how to marry detailed policies and practices and controls up to the leadership, because priorities and accountabilities, as we know, have to come from leadership. And you can write policies and procedures, but what will happen is people really know on a day-to-day basis, people really know what leadership cares about. They know what leadership is thinking about. They know what behaviors leadership rewards. They know. So it's not just a matter of talk or writing policies and procedures. We need a way to turn these controls into actual behaviors. We need a way for them to become part of people's jobs, part of their thinking. And of course, the glue between the leadership and the accountability and the controls is really this whole culture and commitment. And I found, and I think we continue to find, that this is the area that managers and security leaders really have to focus on. As John mentioned earlier, if you have a staff, you're going to have trained technical people, you have availability of consultants and other people that you can hire. As a security leader, you're going to find that a lot of your focus and a lot of your work and a lot of your challenges is really going to be focused in the culture and commitment area. Did you want to add anything to that, John?
No, I think I'm good, Paul.
Okay.
Hey, Paul, I'm going to make a quick comment as well, because I think another element the program brings, and I'm keying in on leadership level accountability, is that if there's an absence of a program, it can actually mean that risk is being accepted at levels of an organization that shouldn't actually be allowed to be making those levels of risk decisions, because they have that far-reaching effect on not only the organization, but maybe even more broadly. So the formalization of a security program and allowing for that communication to reach up to leadership can allow leadership to be that position to make those decisions and to hold that accountability.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You could have a case, for example, where someone in the organization might think that a security practice is not worth it. It's too troublesome or costs too much money, and they may make a decision. I don't think we really want to be bothered with that right now, but that might not be the right level to make that decision, because there could be an exposure, a cyber exposure, a risk exposure as a result of that decision. So if leadership is not really in the loop, in fact, setting the priorities and setting the accountabilities, you're absolutely right. You could find yourself unnecessarily exposed to risk without the leadership even really understanding what's happening. That's a great point.
All right, so can you share with us a preview, an overview, high-level 10,000-foot view of what is in the course content?
Yeah, sorry. This is John. So the course is basically broken up into two parts. The first part is an overview of the ICS cybersecurity landscape, and the intent of part one is to give the attendees a good broad level set in terms of just what are the risks the industry faces because of that revolution you talked about earlier, Doug, about how why this is a problem now, and particularly now because of how much automation has changed over the decades. And occasionally you have some people that think, well, we've been running this plant for decades and we've never had an incident, so why should we do something about this? Well, it's because the landscape has changed. Our systems have changed, the threats have changed, the vulnerabilities are constantly being exposed, and so on. So we'll talk about that. Of course, we'll talk about some of the real things that are happening, the real incidents that have been that have occurred and have been documented. And we're not going to spend a lot of time in this class rehashing old, discussed incidents, but we are going to look at a few, particularly the more recent ones, and do a little bit of a dive into those to talk about what really happened and try to separate some of the fact from the fiction too, and some of the hype. So people understand what really, just to help them really get an understanding of what are the true risks out there. Because as Paul alluded to earlier, we both really believe in a risk-based approach, as most industry does in managing cybersecurity risk. And then the third thing we're going to talk about in that first part is, and Paul talked about this already, about there's so many different standards out there, best practices, standards, regulations. And when you first get involved in this field, if you're new to ICS cybersecurity as a discipline, it can be really overwhelming. Paul and I both went through this independently at different parts of our career, where you're reading and reading and reading all these different documents, and it takes a while to get all of that straight in your head. and to kind of compartmentalize that. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework helps a lot by providing that framework and that rationalization of that. And what we're trying to bring to the table here is we know that managers in this space don't have the time to read all these documents. So what we're trying to get across in this short day, in this day, is to give them enough information so that they're armed with a good understanding of what is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, what are the standards that are associated with that, and how really almost any standard can be mapped back into that. And how that also impacts different regulations and so on, so that they have a good working knowledge of the standards, of the lingo, so that if, for example, if a vendor comes to them and says, well, my products are 62443 compliant, that the manager can come back and say, well, what part of 62443 are you talking about? It's a 13-part standard. Specifically, when you say your product is compliant with it, what do you mean? And which part of the standard? And did you use a third party to evaluate that? And what certification scheme did you use, and so on? So they can ask some intelligent questions, and that's just one example of what we hope will be a takeaway from this first part. And I'll let Paul talk about the second part.
Okay, so there were a couple of slides coming up, John, that were on the topic of part one. I don't know if you want to go into that or not.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I forgot. I was talking, and I do have some slides. This slide, we'll talk about this and others in the class. We just want to give you a sneak preview of some of the slides. So this one talks about what I was saying before about how the landscape has changed so much over the last 5 or 6 decades in terms just of how we control our facilities. The slide, this illustration shows that when you're walking around a petrochemical facility or a water wastewater facility or a pulp and paper facility, on the surface, it all looks the same as it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But when you look at how it's controlled, it's changed dramatically. From relays and pneumatics to starting to analog control and digital control and DCSs and PLCs and field buses and Ethernet and so on. Now we're mobile computing and IIoT and so on. So just our attack surface has changed dramatically. Lots, of course, huge benefits from all this technology, but that convergence of IT and OT has given us a much bigger potential cyber attack surface. And on top of that, at the same time, what we've got going on is the threat landscape is changing. People, unfortunately, are looking for deliberate ways to compromise control and safety systems, unfortunately, to cause harm. So we have to be aware of that as well. And it's really where the threats and the vulnerabilities come together is where we have risk. Threats, vulnerabilities, and ultimately consequences are the basic formula for risk. So we have to understand all three. If you go to the next slide, please.
Yeah. Hey, John, before we press on, what occurs to me here is that changing role and responsibility of those that are building these systems, that are maintaining these systems, just how dramatically the activities that they're involved in, the level of knowledge, the level of responsibility ultimately has changed. I mean, I'm looking at this list thinking about, how is that going to continue to expand into 2030, 2040 with you have IoT and cloud represented there, machine learning, AI, all of that. The prospects of a controls engineer or an automation professional is so different today than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago, of course.
Oh, no, yeah, you think about it. And I have a lot of compassion for the process control and automation engineers that I work with in these facilities. They have to know so much. And at the same time, staffing levels have generally been dropping. And we've got this aging workforce particularly in automation and controls. Where, it's a difficult challenge. I feel bad for people in these roles that not only do they have to manage and maintain all this, but now they have to make sure that it's secure.
I noticed that everything that started back in 1960 is still on the list in 2020.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we didn't take any of that off, right?
All right, here.
Still there.
So I think you kind of hit that point. So here we'll push forward.
Yeah, so and I said I mentioned that we're going to be talking about some of the real incidents, particularly those that have affected operations OT, and we'll do it judiciously in this course. It's not going to be we're not going to go into all of the numerous incidents, but we are going to pick a few, and as I said, do kind of a deeper analysis of those. People understand, kind of what really happened and kind of the anatomy of the attack or in the real outcomes. And then lastly, we're going to, as we said, we'll use the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as exactly that, as a framework to talk about all of the different standards and other governance documents that are out there and how they can all be rationalized back to the framework, and some of the real benefits of that. Because what we have found in our practice is NIST, even though it's U.S. government, it has been adopted worldwide as exactly that, as a framework to bring together both IT and OT cybersecurity into one really pretty easy to understand framework. 5 functional areas, color coded to make it easy. And so we want people to walk out of this class, if they're not already familiar with the framework, which I'm sure many will be, of course, but know how to, it's more not just what it is, but how to use it. I think Paul's going to talk more about that, and is that the framework is great, but it's not a how-to, it's a structure. And then so how to use it, how to get the most out of it is one of the big things we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And John, for those that might not be necessarily following the NIST framework, the fundamentals in the NIST framework are themes and practices that are applicable on so many other guidelines, best practices, and
they
standards
are pretty
as well,
universal.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Paul.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, after we go through that, we'll switch gears slightly, and we'll start to focus on building out and managing an ICS cybersecurity program. And we're going to follow 4 trends when we talk about that. We're going to talk about why and how ICS cybersecurity is becoming a board level concern. IT security is in the news a lot. Most of the articles that you read, most of the news articles that you see tend to talk about the major breaches that are happening in corporate environments. And but we want to start to focus on why ICS cybersecurity and operations level risk is really becoming a concern. The other trend is how IT operations and engineering are joining forces, in some cases and better than others. And so we have, I think between John and I, we have a lot of experiences we can talk about there as those 3 silos learn to work together. And then the final trend that we want to talk about is how we see industrial companies in the United States and across the world, especially among our clients, what we see them doing and what our recommendations are. So if we could kind of jump to the next slide. So on that first trend about becoming a board level concern, one of your challenges as a security leader is to translate this sort of nebulous term of cyber risk into something that the business executives can understand. And over time, I actually don't really even like the term cyber risk because I think it's confusing to business people. It sounds confusing, it sounds mysterious. And I always say to people, what does your safety program manage? And they say, oh, safety risk. What does your environmental program manage? Oh, environmental risk. What does your cyber program manage? Cyber? Not really. There's no such thing as cyber. You're not managing cyber anything. What you're trying to do is recognize that cyber threats amplify the possibility that your business risks will happen anyway. The real risk is business risk. Cyber is more of a technique or a mechanism or a pathway. It's not really a risk. The risk is to your business. And that might sound self-evident or it might sound just like a semantic difference. But I've talked to a lot of business folks over the years. I've talked to a lot of executives. and they tend to not necessarily intuitively make these connections. And so one of the great challenges that any security leader has is to help business folks connect the dots, and to not think so much about cybersecurity as a risk in itself, but to think about the risk that it presents to their business. I always say to executives, think about all the money that you spend managing all of these programs and all of these risks, and now think that a cyber actor could make them happen anyway. So that kind of a light bulb needs to go off. And again, I've talked to a lot of different leaders, plant managers, I've talked to executive teams, and although this seems intuitive to us at many times, again, executives don't always connect these dots. And so this is part of our responsibility as leaders to help make this message and connect these dots. Could we go to the next slide? So here we're talking about the trend of operations, engineering, and IT working together. I always called it the Three Musketeers model. In the operations side of the house, we have these silos and groups that don't often work together. One of the things that we've seen over the years, John didn't talk about it yet, but one of the risk methodologies that we practice, that we actually championed, is called a cyber PHA, a process hazard assessment. One of the things that we found when we do cyber PHAs, workshops, is that it's a lot of times it's the first time these people have even met each other, especially the IT people. A lot of the IT people really don't understand operations, they're not involved. So we've seen some interesting transitions have to take place. I showed this slide once at a conference, and somebody raised their hand and said, hey, you know, at our company, those swords are pointed at each other. So for those of you who are familiar with this, and I'm sure many people are, I think, again, one of the big challenges that faces a security leader in this space is building relationships and building trust and building collaborative techniques and mechanisms and ways for people to work together that are profitable and practical. And that involves, in my experience, it certainly involves a lot of trust building and relationship building. And again, when we think about cybersecurity, our minds go to a security tool or a policy or whether the protocol is secure or not. We tend to focus almost intuitively on the technical aspects. And here you have something that is not technical at all. It is entirely cultural and entirely organizational. And yet, without building these relationships and building these collaborations, your program is not likely to succeed no matter how many tools you install and how many procedures you write. So this is something that we'll talk about, and I think John and I have a lot of stories that we can talk about and a lot of scars and some practical suggestions about how we might enable these three groups to work together. And then I think we have one more quick slide. So we talked a little bit about the NIST CSF. We actually have an approach, since we've been using it in our programs and with our clients. One of the things about the NIST CSF that became very clear to me as I began working with it is that it's not a management system. So when you need to build a program, you really need to think of your program as a management system, right? What is a management system? Well, it's responsible for sustaining an outcome. Right? You want something to be true. You want something to be in operation. You want it to be institutionalized. You want it to become part of the fabric of the company and the way that people work. That's the purpose of a management system. And the NIST CSF, which I love and I use it all the time, it doesn't recognize that concept. There's really nothing about a management system inside the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And so what we did in recognition of that is come up with a way to marry both of those two concepts, and we call it NIST CSF Plus. So basically what we do, and we'll explain this in the class, and we can give you some examples and even some tools that you can take with you to enable you to develop two strategies, really. You need, at the highest level, you need a strategy for your program itself. And this is primarily organizationally related, right? This is a strategy for how to build a program as an organizational thing. We have 5 pillars: governance, risk management, security integration, security implementation, and security operations. Those are the 5 pillars of your organizational strategy. We'll talk in depth about each of those and what they mean. And then underneath of that, you have what we call your control strategy. And that's where the NIST CSF comes into play, because it organizes all of your controls into identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And again, you want to make forward progress across these dimensions at the same time. So for example, let's say that you're in year 1 of your program strategy. You're going to start at, what do you want to accomplish in year 1? Well, in your overall strategy, you want to say, well, how am I going to make some forward progress in governance, some progress in risk management, some progress in integration, et cetera. Also in your control strategy, you can't just do protective measures. What are you going to do on the identify side? How are you going to at least implement some kind of basic detection control? Do you have an incident response plan of any kind? Do you have recovery plans? So one of the things we'll work with the attendees on, the students, is to help you figure out how you can build a comprehensive program. You can address both the organizational and cultural issues in your program strategy. You can address the controls in your control strategy, and you can map it out into a multi-year program, because doing this will take many years. I was working on my program for 4.5 years, and it just almost never stops, right? Because that's the nature of a program. Projects end, but programs never end, right? Because their goal is to sustain the program. Anyway, so that was that.
Hey, Paul, let me ask you. So, on the surface, you look at this and it's like, wow, it is going to be a lot of work. And is it going to require all brand new investment and expanding on budgets, or is there some things that can be leveraged that may already be in place in an organization? I'm thinking specifically around, safety risk management. How is there overlap between existing programs and some of what you're discussing here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there certainly is. For example, most industrial companies have some kind of risk management programs in place. Like you said, they'll have a safety program. They'll often have an operations excellence program. There will be usually a risk matrix that's used for when they're doing HAZOPs and other things like that. So we definitely recommend that people tap into the existing programs as much as possible. You might have a governance team in your executive group already that you can tag into and perhaps create a line item in the monthly meeting of your governance board. So yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely ways to figure out how to get this moving. And you're right, because when you're first starting out, I know in my case, when I first started out, I did not have a staff. It literally was just me. So I had to think really hard about what I could do to make progress in each of these areas. And a lot of it was, kind of feeling my way through the organization, finding other managers or executives that were open to different ideas, trying to work with them. So yeah, basically what we can do is sort of talk through different approaches and different strategies, but every company is different, and what you can leverage in the existing company is, yes, definitely worth considering. It's a great point.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, here, let's move forward. I think so by the way, to everybody that's attending, we are open for questions. There's a couple that have already come in, but please check out your interface there, and you have the ability to ask any questions or make any positive comments that you want. Course materials. Hey, John, talk to us about what a student can expect from a course material standpoint.
Yeah, so of course, like any training course, you can have a course manual or course booklet. So students will have both a paper copy of the course materials as well as, and the course materials will be things like the slides. There will be handouts and exercises, a variety of different templates we will be demonstrating and showing things that we have developed or discovered over the years. That we will share those with the students, and we will also make those available electronically for the students as well, so that they can start to apply and start to use these things.
Yeah, that can of course be very helpful because I'm just thinking a student in the classroom, they live in the now, right? They're going to be learning about a variety of things and mentally thinking about the challenges that they're facing today, and having those materials available at a later point that they can draw from and refer to and even incorporate into their own program is going to be useful. So I know I've had the privilege of seeing some of those templates early that the students are going to see. So that's really neat.
Yeah, it should
Okay.
give people a real leg up, so they can really like walk out of this class and start to put points on the board, if you will.
Perfect. So we've been talking a lot about this one-day course. The launch of this course, the first public launch of this brand new one-day course, will take place at the Oil and Gas Cybersecurity Summit and Training event. So the day following Summit will be focused around this particular course, and there's other options that are of course available as well. So I think one of the benefits, if you're considering attending Summit and then bridging into this particular course, is that you're gonna have that exposure to a lot of the themes and hear about those challenges and some of the practical solutions that folks are already taking in the Summit, and then a much more focused view coming into the classroom where you can think about, okay, how do you distill that down into something that's much more actionable? John, Paul, anything else you want to add around that, or around the bridging aspects of benefits that come there?
I think you stated it well.
Yep.
Thanks, Doug.
Okay. Well, tell you what, guys, if you want to move to some of the questions that have come in, we can keep talking, and again, we're definitely open to anyone if you want to continue to add to the list. So here, let me pick one of these out here. I'm just going to read the question as typed. I've spent 14 years in legacy infrastructure security consulting space. Now I'm going through an ICS learning phase, enrolled in ICS 410. What books, blogs do you recommend so I can stay relevant and know the history and the future? So what type of resources are out there that someone that has all of this experience with infrastructure security, but is now starting to embark on picking up responsibility for ICS? So what do you guys think you could offer there?
You jump in, John?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, there certainly is a ton of information out there to draw from. I guess some of my favorites my go-tos, certainly the DHS CISA organization, what used to be ICS CERT, has great information available on their website. Of course, SANS, ISA, some other industry organizations also offer great information. There are a variety of different published books written by different authors. Paul's working on his own; it's not done yet, but yeah, there's no shortage of material out there, and we will cover we'll cover some of that in our class to try to help direct people towards some of the resources that we found the most valuable over the years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Here's another one. Let's see. Security is a cost of business. What are some of the ways to show its benefits to justify the costs? So in organization, I'm thinking about companies that may look at security as overhead and maybe unplanned budgeting, not thinking about return on investment. So that might be in this question somewhere.
Yeah, it's ultimately cybersecurity it's a risk management exercise. So or risk avoidance, or might be another way of putting it. But there are some operational gains that we have directly seen our clients take advantage of. So by implementing a cybersecurity program to reduce and manage risk to operations and the business risks that Paul talked about, there are a lot of other side benefits that come out of that. One is as Paul was talking about, the breaking down of the silos and encouraging communications between organizations, and by going through some of these risk management exercises and incident response exercises and things like that, it really does bring the organization together. So there's that somewhat intangible but side benefit. The other is, most of the time, the tools and controls that one would put in place to manage cybersecurity will also provide, if done well, will provide reliability benefits and improved uptime to operations. So there's a lot of, a big thing that we have seen in our practice is when we start, doing a deep dive on a facility and looking at their control systems and control system networks, the networks that have evolved, typically over decades, we find all kinds of misconfigurations and vulnerabilities in the networks that really are almost a ticking time bomb for not necessarily a cyber incident, but just not a deliberate cyber incident, but just a breakdown of the network that could lead to unplanned, unwanted downtime. So by going through and doing a deep dive assessment, you find all these things that have just over the years have accumulated, and it's an opportunity to clean those up and overall improve the reliability of operations.
Yeah, those are good ones. There's a few others. One is one of the foundational controls is asset management. So your asset management of your hardware and your devices, and also of all of the software that you have installed, software and firmware and versions. And that's a critical foundational control for security, because there's a principle that you can't protect what you don't know. But it turns out that if you do and create an asset inventory and you keep it up to date, there's a lot of advantages to the organization now to have an accurate inventory and knowing what devices are and what the firmware is, and know to be able to recognize. Companies are often surprised what they find sometimes in their organizations. Yeah, we've seen that.
I didn't know we had that.
Yes. Also, another example is again network diagrams. One of a critical control in any security program is to make sure that you know how your network is set up and configured, exactly how it is set up and configured. And we find that this kind of information generally is not kept up to date, like John was saying. So going through the exercise of getting your documentation up to date has great benefit to understanding what's really going on in your environment. It's very valuable, and security can be sort of the catalyst to start to work on some of these things. And then the other thing I wanted to think about, again, it goes back to risk. The return on investment for cybersecurity is really the return on investment in risk reduction. And part of the job of the security leader is to translate, sort of abstract risks into dollars. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the class, but I definitely would encourage people to think about the business risk exposures that you are confronted with from cyber actors, from cyber threats, and to translate them into either safety risk, environmental risk, or into operational risk or financial risk. I mean, there's a number of categories of risk that all can be translated into dollars. And that's a very critical part of building out the business justification for your program. Because as John said, you wouldn't build a program if there was no risk, because cybersecurity is a risk management program ultimately. So getting a handle on the risk, and again, in industrial companies, I think risk is usually either expressed as safety risk, environmental risk, operational risk, And then there are all of these other financial risks. So taking an expansive view of what a cyber guy could do to your organization and trying to put some dollars to that. Usually the dollars have to be expressed in ranges. You can't just go in and say, well, this is $50,000 worth of risk. It's usually some kind of combination of likelihood and consequence with a range of dollars that are exposed. And once the executive team realizes what the actual financial exposure is to a major cyber attack, especially an operational one, that should help in your business case.
Perfect. Here, guys, I'm going to share. This one's not a question; it's a comment, but maybe you have a reaction to this. It seems like we always talk about the attacks, but I see a lot more problems with mistakes that lead to problems, but no one is talking about mistakes.
No, that's a good point. Paul had talked about our one of our primary techniques that we use to help analyze cyber risk is this cyber PHA methodology, and that methodology, like others, it looks at not just intentional malicious acts, but it also looks at unintentional or non-deliberate causes that could still lead to an undesirable outcome. So it is very important because some data suggests. I used to be pretty involved in an organization called RISI, the Repository of Industrial Cybersecurity Incidents, which unfortunately no longer is maintained. But when I was doing that, and for about 5 years, the ratio of intentional to unintentional attacks of the actual incidents out there was about 20 to 80. In other words, about 20% of the incidents were caused by some malicious actor, either external or internal to the organization. And the 80% of the incidents were caused by a well-intentioned person or a faulty equipment or a mistake, human error, but still it resulted in the same a cyber-related impact. So to that point, that when you're going through this exercise of understanding your cyber risk, you have to look at all of the sources of where the initiating event could come from, whether that be a bad actor, an internal bad actor, an external bad actor, malicious software, or internal well-intentioned employees, contractors, vendors that don't intend to cause a problem, but their actions still could, and that's why it's so important to have some of these a variety of different controls in place that will be able to detect and thwart those kind of potential incidents.
That's great. Guys, we're at time here, and I know there's still a few unanswered questions. We'll try to address those offline, but any closing comments in addition to that invitation you're providing for folks to sign up for this course?
No. We just we thank everybody for your time today, and if you've been thinking about signing up for the course, we hope that today's webinar gave you the added impetus to go ahead and do so. We're really looking forward to this inaugural course through SANS next month. Yep.
Yes, sir.